Well, hello everyone. This is chapter 8 again, part 2. So we already finished chapter 1. We talked about some details of equipment from chapter 8, and today we're just going to pick up from where we left off. So let's talk about ownership costs. We kind of covered some of the details of the ownership cost, and these costs are occurred whether these equipment are put to work or not. And some of these are expenses are depreciation, interest, taxes, license, insurance, and storage. And we kind of talked about some of them. So whether your equipment are put down to work or not, you must pay those. So you have to be smart on making the decision whether to own the equipment or rent it. So then how do we find the cost of those? Well, basically, if they are on annual basis, we just have to add them up and divide them by the expected working hours for the entire year, and then we can convert them into hourly basis. Now, it's also recommended the more you put your equipment to work, the less expensive those equipment will be on you. And the less you have them work, the more expensive will be. So to recoup all these costs, you're gonna have to make a lot of decisions. Like if these equipments were purchased cash, then you're still gonna have to assume those equipment were financed and have the interest rate added to your overall cost. And some of actually those equipment could be half purchased, half financed, and also you still have to count the interest rate toward your overall cost and add it to the hourly rates. We also talked about the tires and how the tires are excluded from the overall depreciation because they get to wear out quickly, and we have this different calculation for them. We covered that in part 2. You can refer back to the equations. But for depreciation and interest, this is the equation we typically utilize. So P stands for purchase price. F for salvage values, if you're going to salvage out the equipment after being utilized. And then you have interest rate, and N is for the useful life of the equipment. Now, as far as the taxes and license, those are must-pay expenses. And since equipment are considered properties, you have to pay taxes on them. And because also these equipment are used on public roads, cities and state require license on them, and to maintain these license, you have to pay annual fees. So you'll have also to count for those as well. And we also talked about how we find the cost of the taxes and license by adding the overall cost annually divided by the total working hour or expected working hour over the year. So the insurance, the company must pay for these properties whether they work or not. And again, it's the same deal. To account for the insurance is by dividing the annual cost by the number of the expected working hours throughout the year. As far as the storage, we kind of talked about this in part 1. So when we measure the expenses of the storage, there's a lot of details we have to take into consideration. Is your storage yard owned or rent? So, and if it's owned, then you have to assume that it's a rented yard, and you have to take this rate into consideration: property taxes, property insurance, fencing, lighting, security guard, and maintenance jobs. If you guys remember when we talked about the overhead office side, where we determined the overall cost and have it as a percentage, and then add it to our overall cost as a percentage. Well, we can do this. We can do the same for the storage for our equipment. So we have the storage as a percentage. determine the overall expenses, divide them by the expected working hours, have them as a percentage. Then every time you want to use this equipment on a job site, you add it on hourly basis. And again, the same deal, those storage or those expenses for the storage must be paid whether the equipment are used or not. And then once those equipment are used for job site, then the cost allocation could be steered to other equipments that you may have. So this is the equations that we talked about in kind of a mathematical format. So we have the annual cost of any those are mentioned, like insurance, tax, storage, and so on and so forth, divided by the expected working hours, and this is how you measure it. So we've talked about the possibility of ownership over this equipment. Now let's talk about leasing versus buying, and later we'll talk about renting versus buying. And what is actually the difference between leasing and renting? Well, for rent or leasing, it's for longer term, while renting is for shorter term. So for instance, here, benefits of leasing, it offers you flexibility. So you don't have to worry about the storage, you don't have to worry about maintenance, you don't have to worry about operation cost, because everything is included, which helps you to reduce the risk of time and clashes of your schedule and so forth. It's easier than financing, in a sense that you put all the risk and all this working details on the renting company. Now the disadvantage is it costs you more because they already made their assessment per hourly basis and how much it costs you, so they add it up to you or on you when you decided to rent it from them, and you have no ownership. So if you decided to salvage it out, if you want to sell it afterward, you don't have any return on investments. So we've talked about this. Now renting here, again, is for shorter term, and for instance, if you want to have it for a half a day, week, or a month, then renting it'd be a good choice. Just like when you're renting a car from a renting company, the rate is fairly high though. Why? Because they counted all the maintenance of the car, lubrications, and depreciations, insurance, and so forth. So they add them up all to your rate, which makes the rate highly expensive, besides they taking the risk. So they also adding a factor of the risk as well. So that we've talked about all the heavy machines, let's talk about the miscellaneous tools. As far as the miscellaneous tools, what do we mean first by miscellaneous tools? Like wheelbarrows, shovels, picks, hammers, hoses, buckets, and ropes, and a lot of other things like drills, harnesses, perhaps, and so many other things. So typically, and we covered that in chapter 7 when we talked about laborers and how we hire them and their productivity and their tools and so forth. So we would like to hire craftsmen where these craftsmen have their own tools, and at the same time, so they can have a sense of responsibilities of maintaining these tools, because it's very common that those tools get lost or stolen. But if you hire a person with their tools, then they'll be probably more protective of them. And in the same time, we pay them. If you guys remember, we talked about the equivalent, the cash equivalent and cash allowance, then we can probably count for those for them. Yeah, we talked about this. Then mobilization. Well, first of all, if we decided to rent or lease those equipment, then it'll be on the vendor to take care of the mobilization, shipping those equipment in and out of the job site and set them up and get them started and so forth. Those are separate costs that we have to pay for, but it's still something to consider. Then other tools and means and method that we need is the cost of erecting these type of tools like hoist, scaffolding, cranes, and how we put them together. We lift them off and we move them around the job site. So for that, we created a checklist for those. And we said, you know what, because we utilize those tools on almost on every job, it'll make more sense to purchase them, to have them on with us for every project to go for. And some of these equipments are lifting cranes, hosting towers, lifted trucks, and telescoping forklifts, and hosting engines, heaters, scaffoldings, and the list goes on and on. But it makes more sense to have them with us. The way we don't have to pay for them every time we start a project, because it's more feasible actually to do so instead of put them always on the craftsman's, and then they have to charge us in return for cash equivalent and cash allowance. So with that, we have concluded chapter 8, the equipment. And if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Thank you, and we'll see you again.